All right, let me introduce myself. My name is Patrick. I lead senior engagement marketing here at Quorum. I have the incredible opportunity to speak to some great folks in public affairs pros through these webinars, through our podcast, through our AI Inner Circles, Wonk Nation, our Slack community, and so much more. This is one of my favorite parts of my role here at Quorum. And second, I want to give a shout out to Molly, who is supporting us in the back end of our webinar. You might see her pop up occasionally in the chat. She's the real hero of today's webinar. All right, with that, I'd love to welcome our speaker to the stage. We are joined by Chary from DCI Group. Chary, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hey, Patrick, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Chary Cynthia. I'm from DCI Group. My background is very versatile. I actually come from a traditional organic social background, learned paid in nonprofit, and now I'm here in public affairs.
Very cool. Very cool. I love how you have such diverse experience and being able to apply all those great marketing and communication skills that you learned from those other spots into advocacy. Because I think advocacy pros have a lot in front of them. There are three big things that we've identified with. One, there being massive audience shifts. Supporter behavior is totally evolving and changing. And there's a lot of expectations, especially as it relates to digital advocacy, that are being raised from experiences outside of advocacy. Like they expect a frictionless experience similar to what they have with Netflix and Amazon, and especially with these different chatbots. They expect everything to be super intuitive and clean and not take a whole lot of time in order to participate. Second, there's a lot of changes going on across the different platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, all those different groups. And a lot of those changes make it really difficult for us to change or for us to mobilize our advocates. So how do we get over that? Plus also a ton of internal pressure. There's a lot of push to be able to prove the ROI of your program and to really grow your advocacy program with oftentimes less budget. So there's a lot that's going up against our advocacy pros right now. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation about 5 things we really need to hear right now in order to grow our advocacy program and become as effective as humanly possible. Now, we're going to go through 5 tips or 5 things we need to hear. And Chary's done an awesome job of putting these together, but I'd also love to know what your advocacy truths are. So in the chat, as we're talking about this, we'd love for you to throw in the things that you think other advocacy professionals need to hear, or something that maybe you needed to hear like a year ago, or big things that you're super proud that you've either figured out or that you really want us to figure out as a community together. So with that, Chary, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. I also want to open with there is no hack to this. So just know that when you are doing any campaign or running any social brand or organization, association, there's no hack. Really, the truth is just consistency. But we'll dive right in to more truths. For clunky forms are campaign killers. So for here, think about when you're buying something or entering a raffle online, you want to make sure that you are collecting the essential information. I think there are times where, more is more, which is great because it's all data that you're collecting. But at the same time, is it vital, right? We want to make sure that, we just want to make sure that we are not asking too much to ensure that there's a low barrier of entry for users. So think of it like a job application, right? Like LinkedIn, easy to apply versus going to an employer's profile and then asking to fill out another profile and putting in your content when you've already submitted your resume. It's very much like that. Sorry, that was the first thing that popped in my mind. So when you're thinking about a mobilization campaign or a grassroots campaign, especially working with Quorum, you can customize those fields. So name, email, zip code, or the address, however, but obviously name and email is very important to accrue your data.
Totally. One of the big things that was talking to some folks about is this idea of like progressive profiling, which is like you ask for more data as you need it instead of getting all that data right up front. So you might be tempted to say, like, okay, for an advocate to register for my program, I think I'm going to need all these different things in the future. So let me ask them about their interests, their, experience, like all those different things right then and there when they sign up for your program. But it's actually a great idea to wait until you actually need that data before they participate in the campaign for you to ask those questions. So you can get them in the door right away. You can hit them with emails, you can hit them with texts and all that other fun stuff in order to get that additional data.
Yes, that's why they call it the welcome series.
Yeah.
Anyway, so another mistake that I've seen professionals do is, sending mass emails out. And that's no shade at all. Sometimes you don't know what to do with the data because it's overwhelming. But in general, if you are collecting your first party data, whether it's through, your sign up on your website or even through social and DMs or any like lead generation campaign, for example, you want to make sure that you're also segmenting your data. And sorry, this is like the nerdy side of me because I also love collecting data and analyzing data as well. So when you're collecting that information, you also want to look at the behaviors because there are two parts, right? You see people who are opening your emails. That's one audience that you can then re-engage, if you will. And there are some people that haven't. That's also another email that you can send out to them in hopes that they would engage. But that's just one way to slice your data. Another way you can look at it's like the demo. If you're asking for how old they are or where they live, like let's say you only have a California grassroots campaign. Why would you hit everybody instead of your Californian subscribers or your data? So it's just really narrowing it down and making sure that every campaign is also very thoughtful. And of course, you A/B test. One language may resonate with a California audience versus someone in Texas. I mean, very different. I have family in both, and trust me, very different dialects. But anyway, like this is kind of what I'm trying to say. Just instead of just seeing what works, I mean, fortunately for digital, you can see what works because you can test the header, you could test the image, you can test anything, and then just making sure that you are sending the right communication to that specific audience.
Totally. When you're thinking about A/B testing, what are some of the things that you think are really important for folks to test with their emails?
Oh, subject line, like the hook. I think now users are or like consumer brands that I've been seeing are using emojis in the email header.
Mm.
I don't know if that always lands because it depends on the recipient, like what is like who carries their email, like Google, Microsoft Outlook, etc. So we don't know. But I just how are you gonna grab the attention? Like I think of it like this is like one-on-one stuff, but it doesn't really change. It just changes where it's being applied to. For example, like, am I gonna watch a 5-minute video on something if the intro is boring on TikTok? First off, I probably may not have the attention span for it, but if it's interesting in the beginning, then okay, you got me. I'm there. I'm present.
Totally, totally. I was thinking about the one tip I got recently was the emojis with like a negative sign or like some kind of like a mad emoji performs way better than like positive emojis in subject lines and things like that. And it's one of those like that might be true for some audiences, but like test it to figure it out.
Yeah,
Is
just
your
always
audience?
test people.
Yeah, totally. And it's really easy to test. So why not give it a shot?
Yeah. Okay, now going to our third truth. I know if I kind of briefly mentioned about data, and I think it's very important to emphasize that you have to really look at it. It's sometimes like, oh, we're gonna make a hunch and see if it works. No, no hunches. It's like we gotta look at the data, okay? And because it tells you the story and what is and what is not working. And I know from, an executive leadership perspective too, sometimes people may not care about how many impressions this had or whatever. I will caveat with that sometimes impressions is the only metric that you have to look at. That's fine. But if you're sharing an op-ed or you're looking at, how many people have participated or took action on your page, those are tangible metrics that you should be reporting out versus like, oh, we had 1 million impressions or whatever. I get it. I do as someone who has been a social media manager and working her way up in her career, but it's looking at those hard metrics is that's what matters more. And there's always like these funny memes on LinkedIn about like marketing, marketing community. It's like, oh, we got so and so engagements, but then did you close like the sales team? So it's, I think the application for here, it's like, oh, that is great. We had a lot of sign up. Did that policy flop? Did something
Mm.
change? Did the senator see our ad? So it's really important to look at your data and making sure that, you know, you know exactly how to read it and report that out to stakeholders.
Totally. One of the tips we got at Wonk Week was about like separating your data into like indicators and then also success metrics. So like an indicator could be, how like what was the open rate on this email? Or, how many like likes and how much engagement did we get on this post, right? Versus the success metrics being, I guess you can decide how you like where you want to draw the line at success could be, okay, we got X number of people to register for our program. That is our success metric. Or it could be the number of people who register for our program is an indicator. The number of people who actually call, is our success. Or, did we get a meeting with that legislator? That is our success. So, in advocacy, the world is pretty open on what your goals here can be, and they change organization to organization, unlike most, brands who's mostly trying to sell something, right?
Yeah.
So like really having a clear, like defined goal of like, okay, what are our success metrics here? And then what are the leading indicators going into that we should follow?
Yes, I should have led with that, Patrick. Thank you for bringing me down. No, I think it really, we have to like take a pause and figure out, okay, like what are we really trying to achieve here? Like, how do all these promotional materials ladder to this bigger picture, right? And I think that will help guide you in what will be success. And if you have nothing to go off of, because this happens often too, like you're always looking at your competitors, right? And competitors in public affairs can be like competing agencies or someone else in the, who is your opposition. So I think if you are just benchmarking against yourself, you could do
Mm.
that. But you also want to understand what your peers are doing too. And that's a lot. That's another thing, but I won't get into that.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for like what are some things that like what are the metrics that some public affairs pros should be looking at as they start like developing out the briefs for their campaigns? Like what are some of the things that are like those indicators that you would point to that you would want to look at versus some of the success measures?
Well, that's the hard part, Patrick, because like, what are we trying to achieve here? Like, if we are trying to have people sign our petition, I'm going to count the numbers that are being like the signatures on that petition as the
Mm.
success metric, right? I think it's cool that people are seeing my ads and like it's reaching like 60,000 people and people are clicking on them. But if that click does not convert to a signature, then it doesn't mean anything to me. That sounds really mean, but I'm also being really honest about this. Like
Yeah,
I like as someone who's worked in digital for a very long time, I think it's easy to inflate numbers, but when you are getting, your stakeholders are asking like, what is the outcome of this? It has to be tangible in some
yeah,
regard.
totally. Well, if you don't mind me asking to like derail a little bit, sometimes like you mentioned, are metrics like impressions or open rates and engagement rates and things like that are really what we have, just to point to. The policy world can be so nebulous and they might not have passed the big bill that we were hoping for that like frankly with what was going on in Congress was probably never going to get passed, stuff like that.
Mhm.
How do you tell that story with the data that you do have to show like how the program was or was not a success?
That's great. No, that's a great question. And I'm like, in my brain, it's like, oh, how would I determine that? People are talking about it. Like, that's no, genuinely, like, is there a conversation or is there a reaction on social? Like, I will
Mm.
look at the engagements in that regard, especially the sharing. If a post, let's say you're sharing an op-ed on Facebook or whatnot about a certain issue, and then you are promoting that specific post, but also if it's gaining organic traction, that means, oh man, this message and this article are really hitting home with these individuals. And then you
Mm.
can see the flood of comments. And that's what I would say. While it may not move policies, but it is encouraging people to discuss it and then act on it, hopefully in the future, especially if you are consistent with posting about the same issues and, over time calling to action amongst your audience.
For sure. And as you're building out your campaigns and stuff like that, how can you leverage data to make those, to build on past successes or to to do the things that didn't necessarily get those metrics before?
Oh man, my brain's gonna get so technical. I'm gonna try not to, but if you haven't installed a pixel already, please do so.
Uh,
That is how you can really retarget your audiences across all your platforms. And I'm gonna try to refrain by going not going crazy. But on Twitter, for example, or X, whatever you want to call it, you can also re-engage users who have engaged with your previous posts before, and you can, especially if it's regarding a specific campaign or issue, let's just say, you can retarget them so they can see it again, if it's a continuation or if it's a series, if you will. But there are ways to do it. It's just making sure that the technical side, which I find sometimes is the gap in public affairs, and I don't want to offend anybody, sorry if I did, but you really got to learn that stuff, the technical stuff, in order to also have a successful digital campaign.
no doubt. No doubt. All right, let's move on to truth number 4 about influencers.
Okay, cool. So this is no surprise. We are being fed influencer content online all the time about oh, this new diet fad or blah, 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 blah. But what does that actually look like in our industry and public affairs? I'm chronically online, so you guys can see that intellectual influencers is this new thing on the rise, but not necessarily new, maybe to some folks. But right now is utilizing voices that also have the credentials to back it up. So it could be an economist, a PhD, a registered nurse, to actually talk about that specific issue that they are well versed in. And something important to note too, for anybody on the client side, right? Or if you're a brand, if you are partnering with a social media influencer because you want to leverage their audience, you have to know that there needs to be a piece of authenticity, because that's why these influencers have the large following that they do. It's because of their uniqueness and likeness of their voice. So I say that because as someone who has been on both sides, there has to be some flexibility. While yes, I want you to hit these key messages, I also want you to be yourself, because that's why you have amassed a large following. And I have to also say that in some cases, this may not be the right tactic, leveraging, influencers, but it depends on the level of noise, if you want to make, if you will, or what is the overarching goal. So while yes, we're throwing things out there here in this webinar, just making sure that think back, what is the goal here, what I'm trying to achieve.
Totally, totally. I'm curious if anybody in the chat has leveraged what we would refer to as influencers for their advocacy campaigns. Can you share a little bit more about what do you mean by influencers? I think oftentimes when we think of influencers, we think of I don't know, people who hold makeup like this, or something. Yeah, exactly. But how are you currently seeing folks utilize influencers in the advocacy game?
Okay, so in my brain, it's just I don't know if it's an org chart or different buckets, if you will, because my background is also consumer. So when I think of social media influencers, I think of those who do a lot of the social media content trying to sell you things, right? That's my traditional version of an influencer. Social media content creators in that vein. But when we're thinking about public affairs, policymakers are influencers, are they not? Hot take, but they are, because they too have a large following on social, or at least they have certain constituents following them on social, and their microphone is their social platform. So I think we need to kind of figure out oh my gosh, hold on, I'm thinking in real time and my brain is oh, but anyway, sorry. Policymakers are influencers too. So I am very explicit with my team when we speak about how we want to leverage influencers. I'm are we talking about, average Joe and Jane, social media influencers, or are we talking about a specific policymaker who has great influence on something? So I think that is kind of where we're at.
Yeah, totally. How do you think of the difference between like an intellectual influencer versus uh, like lobbying influence who has funds? This is a great question from Barbara. Let's go ahead and throw this one up really quick.
Oh
Intellectual
man.
versus lobby influences who have funds. How or when to use for getting the right person? What are your thoughts?
Ooh. Okay, hold on. And I have to read it again. I don't, do lobbyists have, that's a silly question. Yeah, they
Yeah.
do. They have it. I don't know. That's like, I actually am at loss right now.
One of the things that I was
Because,
thinking with this was like how oftentimes when you're choosing lobbyists or when you're choosing an influencer or somebody else to bring in, like you have to ask the questions like, am I doing this for reach or if am I doing this for message? Like, am I doing this because I think they have like this is the message that will hit the hardest if it comes from this source versus like, can I tap into this person's reach? And I think that really helps out a lot
yeah,
when about intellectual influencers who are great. They might have a little bit of reach in like their specific policy niches, but like where they're really helpful is like delivering that message by giving that kind of clarity and the authority on what they have to say. So I think like that's one of the big things that you really have to think about as you're trying to get the right person for that campaign.
that's a great, that's a great response, Patrick.
Thanks. Thanks.
You can
All
have
right,
my job.
let's go to. Well, I love your idea. Can you talk a little bit more about like why intellectual folks like work really well, or like PhD or economist folks making that content online? When I think of influencers, I think of people on the beach looking very good, and this is a very different like kind of influencer. Can you share a little bit more about like why those groups of people work really well?
We all know, and let's not pretend, that on social media, there's just a lot of noise in general, whether it's true, false, whatever, right? And I think working with the right individuals that do have certain credentials and also knowing them like this is their stance on a particular issue, it's going to help accelerate or make that message louder. Um, I already forgot your question, Patrick, and I hope I was on track. My bad.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, totally.
I think, and like, I don't mean to sound like elitist either and saying like having these credentials, it doesn't have to be like this fancy PhD. While yes, that certainly helps.
Yeah,
Other speaking engagements that this person has been speaking on could also help their credibility, right? I think we can really look into that, what it means to have the credentials and the credibility even more. But I do think, sometimes it's not always the large following either
yeah.
that means that they are an expert on this issue. Oftentimes, I feel like it's really the quiet people who know a lot of information, but they just don't know how to market themselves outwardly. That uh, could also be another messenger. But I think when we think about in general, like social media influencers and tapping them for any campaign, right? It's the reach that you're going for. So that has to also be a consideration when you're thinking about your overall strategy and the goal here, because really you are doing it just to get your information out there, not necessarily having everybody like or their audience to mobilize necessarily.
Yeah, for sure. And there's something good to point out around the idea of like people are, whether the term intellectual, is not necessarily associated with their level to access to education. I think that's a great comment from this person. And I think oftentimes what you have to figure out though is like with the like how what are the different voices that you're bringing into your campaign? One of the most effective things we've seen recently is using video messages
Hmm.
from advocates directly. That's not like from in front of an expensive camera, but just like holding their iPhone up and recording a message and telling their story. And they can be incredibly clear and poignant. And because it's their lived experience, they are able to make that message really hit. So having that in combination of like, okay, well, here are some of like the macro trends we've seen. to kind of to influence people depending on, what really moves them. And also going back to testing, of going A/B testing, like what kind of messages do we see impact folks the most? So you can see like, okay, did bringing in someone or did bringing in a doctor help with this, or did bringing in a patient really move the needle with these different audiences? I think it's always really great to track, check.
Yeah. Again, not a one size fit all. What may work on the consumer side may not always be applicable to public affairs. So it's just being really smart about where you want to leverage these extra voices and if it makes sense, because sometimes it may not, and that's fine.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's go into truth number 5.
Cool. Truth number 5, talking about integrated strategies. This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about because sometimes, everyone's like, oh, should we be on this platform? Should we be there? But does it make sense? And when it comes to a campaign, I think we tend to rely on like the tried and true channel that works, but taking a step back from like that specific channel and just looking at the whole platform, right? Like all the social media ecosystem and the digital ecosystem. I think for any campaign to be successful, you have to at least do more than one channel. How I break it down is basically this, like Twitter and X, that is, journalists, policymakers are on there. So why, like, thinking through your message, if it makes sense to put it on there, go ahead. But also, do you think another channel will be appropriate? I don't often see policymakers on Meta, so why would you invest there? But maybe they're on LinkedIn or their staffers are on LinkedIn, so it makes sense to go there. And then obviously, programmatic is another like big player in the game as well, and that gives you its own targeting capabilities. But on social, you just want to understand the lay of the land and then kind of figure out what you're trying to achieve and picking the right channels for it.
Totally, totally. How do you think about like channels building on top of each other? So like using, you like you mentioned of doing those retargeting ads and things like that on people who visit your page. How do you think about like the roles that different channels play in like a more integrated strategy?
Ugh. There's that meme of that one lady with all the math equations. Like
Yeah.
I have that right now, but I also need to figure out how I'm going to convey this. So anyway, can you repeat your question again, Patrick? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on like how the different channels play together? Instead of just thinking about, okay, we're going to run this campaign, let's send 2 emails about it, of thinking about like,
Mhm.
okay, how does social help with, that compared to, just doing emails, of taking a multi-channel approach for your
Yeah,
campaigns?
yeah, yeah. Okay. When I kind of like what I mentioned earlier about understanding the lay of the land of social media platforms, you also need to like figure out like what are they best known for or what's the type of demographics on there too, right? So for example, I will never run a conversion campaign on X or Instagram necessarily. Well, Instagram is part of Facebook and Meta, so yes, maybe, but I would never run a conversion campaign on
Hmm.
X necessarily. That is just more of like you want to make sure you're keeping your message and the attention on the feed, and that's that, right? But in terms of message alignment with your emails, it nods to that same campaign, but how you tell it is very different because you wanted to make sure that it is appropriate for that specific audience. And that's that going back to like the one size fit all and copying and pasting, like not it's not going to work there. Like you're saying the same thing, but how you say it, when you say it, and how it looks is also going to determine its success. So, for me, it's just kind of figuring out what the platform's strengths and weaknesses are and just based on historical digital trends. And that's how I can make my move. But yeah, like for me, any mobilization or grassroots campaign, I'm going to run on Meta because that's where we see a lot of conversions. And actually, that's how we had a couple of success in Marfrio issue campaigns recently because it's just easier to mobilize people, and especially if they're older demographic too. It's messed up because I'm a millennial and people are like, you're basically a boomer on Facebook. And I'm like, no, I'm not. It's still it's still like a very, you know, useful channel.
Yeah, totally, totally. The one of the things that we were was testing for a while was like, if we run ads and things like that, to that same audience? How does that impact other channels? And one thing we found is that people were more likely to engage with our emails if they had also seen ads from us. And so things like just like adding that additional credibility on top is like, okay, sure, maybe that ad didn't actually, convert on anything, but it made these other channels that much more effective. So like we should bring that in as part of our strategy. So I think you're totally right. Like rather than just thinking about, one channel at a time for each of these campaigns, or, thinking about your campaigns just as a email channel, like really leveraging all these other channels like text, like, these ads is
Yes.
definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and I think, as we continue to see the digital space getting really noisy, again, it's kind of like echoing back to what I said earlier about looking at your data and figuring out where's the best place to play, and then making sure you always test your message to see what lands.
Totally.
Um, I know like sometimes everything needs to be up yesterday, so we don't have the time or the luxury of time to like create more assets and stuff, but I think there needs to be a level of investment and just like I love the get it done attitude, don't get me wrong, but there needs to be a little bit thoughtfulness and strategic thinking behind stuff before they go live.
For sure. For sure. I think AI can be really helpful there as we're trying to figure out
Yes.
as it comes to like personalization, for example. Like one of my first forays into using it was to I realized a lot of my messaging was very, I don't know, like I was trying to write a paper for, a 400 level course. But like, so I just threw it in and said, hey, can I make this more plain spoken, like a way a human actually talks? Things like that was super helpful. But then also realized I can change that for different groups. So had different versions of messages for different audiences, and being able to quickly generate that was super, super helpful. Still my voice, still all my facts, still all my message, but just made it a little bit more coherent for different audiences.
Hmm.
Cool. All right, we do have a couple bunch of questions that are put in the Q&A. If you have any other questions, please throw them in the Q&A tab on the right hand side of your screen. We also have a couple of docs, so if you want to learn more about DCI Group, a group that Chary is part of, you can go ahead and click there. And you can also learn more about Quorum Grassroots, product related to advocacy, and then also you can grab your slides or copy of the slides as well. All right, let's go ahead and answer some of these questions. One question is, do you have any suggestions on how to learn the technical side? I'm not really sure where to start. How would you
YouTube
recommend?
University. Sorry, I read the question too fast. Uh, didn't mean to cut you off, Patrick. Yes. So YouTube is a really great resource. And like if you're a visual learner like I am, I think that's the best place to find the hub. Yeah, it does matter about like how you search for things, kind of like Google. So for here, when you go on YouTube, you figure out pixel installation on Meta or Facebook, and then you'll see a series of video. And like, naturally, there's always an update on every platform every year. So just make sure you're watching the latest and greatest. I do believe Facebook has their like support and resources too, but that's all words. And to me, I need words and image or video because that's how I learn. So you figure out, the best channel for that.
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of this is like there's so much you got to learn by doing things.
Yes, yes,
So, like setting out and saying, okay, how can I increase the efficacy of this campaign through XYZ channel? And then say, all right, we're going to commit $200 to XYZ ads on this channel. Now it's time for me to learn how to do it. And then you're right, turn right to YouTube University. Or frankly, sometimes I turn to TikTok University whenever I need my
yes,
associate's degree instead of my bachelor's there, it's like if they can't convey the idea in 60 seconds, I don't want to hear it.
yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely recommend starting by trying to solve a challenge. And then, there's like boundless resources on how to do it online as well. All right, got another great question here around the we mentioned on tip number 1 about keeping our forms short. So the question is, unfortunately, Congress requires a lot more information to accept direct messages if they're part of the Communicating with Congress initiative. Any tips how to explain why we're asking a lot of that information from the end user? So do you have any tips on like trying to or explaining to your advocates why you need things like their address and things like that?
That's a really great question. And for their address, I'm only thinking just from like the advertising and marketing POV, right? When I'm talking about segmenting my data, but that information can also be used to verify if this is a legit person, right? I think they're like the same way that we're asking for email, if this is a valid email. I think it's just the authenticating, like, oh, this person does exist. This person is a real person. It's not a spam, things like that.
For sure, for sure. I think part of the, again, I know this goes against truth number one about, but there is occasionally such thing as good friction of things that like you do that reinforce the quality of your action. So by explaining that like, hey, we need your address to prove that you are their constituent, to say like, hey, if, and also if they know your neighborhood and they know, they can, like they know who you are. Like that really reinforces the message that it's not just a bot, that's sending this in. This is a real person communicating the real story. So one of the tips that we've seen is adding a section is like, why do we ask this information? And it's usually around if ensuring your advocates know that they're getting like guaranteed delivery to the Hill, and then you're being a good steward for their message of saying that, like, we're going to make sure that this is the most impactful thing for you. I think about that a lot on the marketing side of the house. It's just like, do we add this question that'll help me personalize the experience for my event attendees or anything like that? And we have to think like, is it clear that when they're adding in this information that like they're going to have a better experience, or the outcome that they're hoping to achieve is more likely to get done? And it's a pretty clear litmus test. If the answer is no, we don't include it. And if the answer is yes, we do. So great. We had a great truth that came in from Chary Whitworth saying, truth, your list is made up of different people with different reasons for engaging with your organization. Treat them that way. There are so many ways to do that. So exactly, there's so many reasons why people decide to join your program. And treating them all as one, monolith is not nearly as successful as recognizing all those different aspects there. Also, one of the big pieces of advice I got that I thought was super impactful was people don't feel invited until you invite them specifically. So when people read a message, their initial thought is, this is not for me, this is for someone else, right? Like this is, for parents, or this is for, this group that is directly affected by this thing. By being able to speak to them by like their state, or to speak to them by something that they ascribe to with their identity, they'll be way more likely to participate because they think this is actually for them. So I think that was one of the big things that really stayed with me. All right, great question here from Barbara. Do you think getting constituents to contact their legislator is a waste of time? Are constituents really pressure on legislators, or lobbyists or funders getting to legislators with good materials the way to go? Both. Who is the real pressure? Isn't that the way to get your goal? Question. So does, connecting people to the Hill still have as much of an impact?
Barbara, you're killing me. I think this is your second question, and you're coming with the tough ones. So for this, I think, I know, like, budget restrictions kind of limits what you're able to like try, right? But for me, I'm actually, we this is no sponsor post or anything, but we are working with Quorum on a grassroots effort right now. That's a letter desk campaign, and part of that is just to show attention to those healthcare regulators, like, hey, this issue is really serious and people really do care about it, and this is a nationwide campaign, right? Our clients are also very happy that we're making that noise happen online through these petitions or letter desk campaigns or whatnot. I think it just really depends on, there's a lot, it's I hate that it depends, but it really does. Like, there's so many elements that factor into that, your question, Barbara. And I'm really sorry I don't have a solid one for you, because it's not black and white always for me. It's just a lot of considerations. But I will say, like, working at a public affairs firm, our clients do it that way. Again, this goes back to diversifying your efforts and your channels. That is just one piece of the pie. There's other things moving too, to that ladder, to this bigger effort of getting this policy flopped or reaching their, Congress member or whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's two big things that really stand out to me, and we've seen a lot of the like policy wins from folks who leverage their grassroots advocates. First is being around. Often, the advice that I heard was that legislators, their default opinion, if it's not something that they already care a ton about, or is like the economy at large, is whenever they hear about a new issue, they think, okay, my voters don't really care about that, you know. And so being able to prove them wrong is always
Hmm.
to be able to point to. The other one is using it in conjunction with your lobbyists. So if your lobbyists are able to come with a story that's from a grassroots advocate, it's going to be way more impactful, especially if you're able to tell a story about a business that they know, or like an institution in their district that they can reference. That really makes the ask hit a lot harder. And so, like being able to pair your grassroots advocates with the stories that your lobbyists are telling on the Hill, and in the 50 states is super, super impactful there. All right, let's go ahead with another question. Just saw a great question in from Erica. How do you recommend we keep audiences warm? Is there a benchmark on how often you should be engaging and sending to them?
Ooh, I like this question. Um, I don't. Let me see. Hold on. Is there a benchmark for how often we should be engaging and sending to them? Well, it depends on the channel. Are we talking about like email here? Because there's a whole series, like we said, the welcome email series or any other stuff. It's I don't. I don't have a benchmark. I'm going to be blunt. But in terms of keeping your audiences warm, I think consistency is the key here. Now, that sounds super vague, but then that means like, if you're talking about a specific issue and only that issue, and you see this like frequent commenter, right? Like, there is also value engaging directly with them. You can also pull them, if they're a supporter, you can also somehow move them into a different tier of like the audiences. I think for me is just making sure that you're consistent when you're sending communications, and like there has to be like a cadence that you just kind of follow.
Yeah, for sure. And I think your audience comes to expect based off of the cadence that you've already established.
Correct.
So like the audience comes to expect something once a month and they look for it. Again, I think again this depends on every organization is different, but it's definitely something you can test. Going back to testing, is the you can segment into two different audiences, and you can see if there's been email drop off on list A versus list B.
Hmm.
So you send an email once a week to this group. It's an email once a month to this other group, and see if there's drop off over that month. Or like what are the characteristics of those two different groups, and you can see like what is the what is the difference there. So I wish I had an answer I could say like 3 times a week and then you're good to go there.
Yeah.
But at least relates to email, it's going to be very depending on each different organization. All right. Let's go with a question around we got one from Michael. Want to get to this one? Sorry if I was out during a meeting. Look forward to. Can you share a little bit more about Quorum's new video campaign function and how you effectively used it based off of this convo? Yeah. So one of the campaigns that you can start up with Quorum is a video campaign where your advocates can tell their stories with the prompt that you provide them, just with their phone or with their laptop. So it'll pop up a video, they answer a question, and then you have a repository of all these great videos from your advocates that you can then share on the Hill or through ads or through any way that you like to use those customer stories. I think that as we're starting to get AI driven content is all the rage and is everywhere. These like super authentic handheld videos that look a little like someone just took them in their house, not on like a sound stage, become super, super impactful. So that's one of the big things that we launched, and we have some really cool stuff coming up here soon to share what you can do with those videos. I don't want to spoil it yet, but check your email next week. There's going to be some really cool stuff in there. All right. Great, great, great. Let's see what else we got here. How do you countermeasure misleading information on your sector from your rivals or biggest organizations that have more lobby funds? Do you test the audience response to misleading information? Yeah, I'm curious if you've had any experience, around like disinformation, or how do you combat messages from other groups?
If you don't have a social listening tool in place to kind of see what the narratives are and who's having those conversations and the sentiments around them, I would encourage you to do so. But if you don't, you can do it manually. It just takes more time and you have to sift through all the individual content to kind of determine like, oh, is this like, what is our opposition saying about us and things like that. And how I see it is understand what is that existing conversation. If you did a campaign, see how that did that change the sentiment of the overall conversation? Did it combat it? Did it not? Like did it make any impact at all? And then that's kind of like your overall analysis. If your messaging did land versus the opposition. I
For
hope that
sure.
makes sense. Sorry, I'm just like thinking tactically, like in my brain, like, oh, I know how to answer this, but I don't. Ugh. Anyway, sorry.
No, for sure. I think there's so many different things to do there around like combating information that other groups are putting out, and I think oftentimes leaning on stories from your advocates to share like what their real life experiences are like really shines out amongst others. So you can, I feel like you can right now you can go back and forth on different facts all day, but oftentimes it's the stories that really stand out and that folks will remember. Here's one I'm excited for because you can share a little bit more from your consumer experience of going, what are some things that D2C brands are doing well that we should steal from?
This is a good question. I think consumer brands do a lot of like social media campaigns that live on social that doesn't necessarily direct people to a specific landing page. In my experience working in public affair, again, very minimal, but still just everyone's like, oh, let's send them to this op-ed, let's send them to there. Sometimes when you want to keep your audience warm or just have them be interested in you as an organization, you just want to make sure you're putting content out there just to know that, the organization is still alive or whatever it is. And just being back to consistent. I think that is one thing that I have yet seen. I mean, I think when we're looking at, big political campaigns or political figures like the president election or whatnot, that was like a social first campaign when we saw it from both parties, right? I thought that was really cool. Sprinkle in some CTAs here and there, but don't get too far off of the agenda. Like, you should still be talking about issues as much as like meme content is really fun and engaging. I think there needs to be a healthy balance, and just making sure you're consistent with your cadence.
Yeah, totally. I think that's such a great example of one of the things you mentioned there about the different, don't get stuck on one channel. Of saying like, okay, our social can provide this
Mm-hmm.
benefit. It might not necessarily being to immediately go sign up for this, campaign or for our advocacy program. But like we have all these other channels that will then push people to participate in that program. Right now, my goal is to get them so they understand why it's important, and to like stick in their brain somehow. So I think that's a really great example
Yeah,
of something that D2C is doing really well. All
it's
right,
just
another
entry
question,
point.
which is what paid channels are good for what? You said Meta was good at conversion. What other tips do you have there?
Oh, you guys, this goes back to the overall, like, what are we trying to achieve here? Like and like I mean that in the very nicest way, because like what are we trying to do? So like if you are looking to have a rapid response and react to something that's happening on the hill, then obviously Twitter is the prime channel for that. I don't know how quickly conversations are moving on Meta these days, but and like Meta's good for the conversions and engagements, things like that. But in general, we have to understand that when it comes to these social platforms, they don't want you to get off of them and they want you to stay focused on their platform. So think about when you're trying to link back to something, just be very careful or be very smart, right? If there's a way to put all that information out there and make sure the user is staying on the page and like reading your posts, that is great. I don't have a hard or fast rule here, but just know that like you just have to understand the lay of the land, your audience and where they're playing, and then activate there.
For sure, for sure. So like so you mentioned Meta's really great at conversion of getting people to like click on the thing and go take the action. Twitter's really good at like rapid response. Are there any other channels that you say like their superpower is blank, or like we'll go to this channel for XYZ?
I just read an article recently that more users are also spending a lot of time on LinkedIn too. And I think we're also seeing the shift of LinkedIn as like a social channel from this is a place where I'm connecting professionally. And now it's evolving to a little bit something else where it's a mixture of both play and business, if you will, and like trying to position oneself as a thought leader. Like that is definitely the channel you want to go, right? So like I have been doing thought leadership content since 2016 for organizations and clients, and that's LinkedIn is the best way to kind of get them out there. You know, if they're getting featured on Bloomberg Business, make sure you share it on LinkedIn too, or some snippets of it. I always try to encourage clients to link back to their website as much as I can versus linking to an article that's hosted on another, publisher or whatever, because you want to make sure you're collecting that data. It sounds really creepy, but it's actually very valuable. But anyway,
yeah, that could be. Well, I see something from Claire, which I thought was great, from Claire Manning saying they're seeing great engagement on action alerts on LinkedIn. And I think LinkedIn, I don't know, is a channel that we should be looking at a good bit more often as it comes to advocacy, especially for professional organizations, of really leaning into LinkedIn to participate in campaigns. All right, I got a question here around texting. So how does texting play a role? I'm hesitant to send my first texts.
The best thing about texting is like you already know that you have a direct contact with this person. Again, this goes back to the overall strategy and budget limitations, etc. But like if I had millions of dollars to activate a big strategy, texting is definitely one of them because you can just get in front of them and say, hey, there's this thing that I need you to sign. Please sign it here. You can learn more here, whatever. And I think this is an area that is, I want to say a little bit untapped, but we also know there's a lot of like policy changes too with Apple and things like that. So just keep an eye out. But it's underrated and definitely should utilize it more. And there's so many companies out there, even in the DC market, where they're really mastering this craft. So I would say wherever it makes sense to put a text campaign into it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. We got a great comment here from Brittany saying we've seen amazing engagement on advocacy actions from our text program, less successful in fundraising. That totally makes sense to me. That like getting a text saying, hey, I need you to do something, not necessarily pull out your wallet, to do it, is super, super impactful. I'm sure everybody on this call gets, tons of text messages from politicians being like, hey, it's me just calling because today is the most important day of our lives when it comes to sending me $5. Like that, having something saying, hey, you can have a direct impact on policy just by taking this action is really, really helpful. Saw some stat that was like average email open rate somewhere around 25%. Average text open rate is somewhere around 95%. So using text messaging to your advantage, especially on those like really rapid response campaigns is super, super helpful. And then going back to, you mentioned about like not just blasting your whole advocate base of thinking about, if you're hesitant to send your first text, maybe send it to the folks who have already participated in your campaigns, who are, rely on you and are, folks that are a big part of your program. All right, y'all. With that, I wanted to thank you all so much for joining, and huge thank you to Chary for sharing all these great ideas and truths, and to walking us through your process. This was so fun together. And thank you to everybody else in the chat who threw their ideas and through really thoughtful questions. As a reminder, we will distribute the recording in the next day or two, so please keep an eye out for that. And thank you all so much for joining. This was a great time.
Thank you.